The Russians saw the explosions followed by enemy gunfire as they headed toward the trench they were supposed to take. They went down toward it, hearing the crackling of as many weapons as a man could bring to bear in combat to end the lives of others of his kind. The rifles fired into the enemy bunkers in that terrifying advance. In the same way, other Marines ran desperately across the fields, watching their columns being decimated. They tried to hitch a ride to escape and avoid the plague of drones that was about to arrive, finishing off anyone left behind. These were the days of fighting between the Russian Marines and the Ukrainian troops in Donetsk. These were the days when the advances on Novomikhaylivka began in earnest. The Marines of the 155th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade of Russia had a mission for more than 2 years to take Vuhledar. It was a city that became a challenge by repeatedly repelling everyone from their best troops to less trained soldiers sent in waves of attacks with armored vehicles, constantly trying to get through minefields and drone storms. From inside, the 72 and Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine defended the territory with boldness, keeping the powerful Russia at bay. More than 2 years of war, and all that the 155th Russian accumulated around Vuhledar were failures and scraps of metal. It's not that the Marines hadn't achieved anything before. Several cities were taken from the 72nd in epic battles, but Vuhledar was still an insurmountable barrier, even for a unit with so many resources. The map of Donetsk was studied by the commanders who began sending some of the Marines to Novomikhaylivka. That would be a new route, but first there needed to be pressure on Vuhledar. The Russian Navy tanks prepared for another assault against the Ukrainian trenches. Winter had passed when the crew began preparing the ammunition. The Marines' flag fluttered over the tank below the cage that would help protect against drone attacks. The shells were prepared with an automatic loading system working to deliver destruction quickly against the Ukrainians. The tank moved into position. It could be kilometers away from the target and still hit it. The reloading mechanism worked perfectly, and the sights locked onto the Ukrainians moving in the trench. The firing began, filmed by drones that detected the smoke filling the defenses of the T-72. The T-64 Ukrainian, which tried to leave Vuhledar to help counterattack, had no luck. A Lancet easily found it moving, exploding over it. The flames started quickly as the ammunition was hit. It didn't take long to follow the tradition of Soviet tanks of a catastrophic explosion. The 72nd wasn't the only brigade facing the Russian Marines in Vuhledar. Troops like the 74th Reconnaissance Battalion or the 68th Jaeger Brigade suffered from Russian shelling when they were supporting the region. The aerial plague of drones surrounded the city, giving no rest to the Ukrainians in the defensive formations around the buildings. The kamikazes were there to take lives. The Ukrainians also had their own drones. In the areas where the Russians expanded, they found piles of mines that would be used to strengthen the defenses of the newly captured areas. The arsenal was destroyed with a grenade, causing a massive explosion. The drones with grenades were part of the arsenal used against the Russians who tried to settle into the trenches during the winter. It was desperate trying to hide from these aerial killers, dropping their seeds of fire over the hideouts. The drones found the Russians during their marches, dropping grenades among the men and making them roll on the ground in an attempt to escape the shrapnel. At that same time, the Russians attempted an attack in Saradodik, east of Vuhledar and south of Novomikhaylivka. It was one of the probes in the region carried out with dozens of armored vehicles. The kamikazes from 72 spun their propellers toward the tanks and IBMPs. There were so many attacks that they themselves filmed the results of the previous strikes, which had consumed the metal of so much equipment. The result of the attack was a field full of fire and explosions in January 2024. The pieces of war turned into pyres in the middle of the trails, abandoned by the soldiers and repeatedly hit by drones to prevent any chance of recovery. At least 13 became scrap that day. The Russians did not let it go unpunished. The artillery rained down its bombs on Vuhledar, trying to force 72 to stay inside the city, while the probes continued to tighten the siege. Their drones targeted the men protecting the trenches. The propellers buzzed quickly as they dove to find the soldier's body and tear off whatever parts they could. Many times they left men lying on the ground in a way that their families would never recognize them. Winter passed and the landscape turned green, but the drones were still there. Dozens of grenades were dropped on Ukrainian positions. The FOM, nicknamed Little Lemons by the Russians, could effectively spread fragments over more than 30 meters, even though their explosion had a much shorter radius. It was more than enough, however, to blow up the holes where the Ukrainians were hiding. The Russian sniper known as Sirugian took part in the siege of the city. Together with his spotter, he wandered among the buildings on the outskirts of Vuhledar, looking for positions to shoot at the Ukrainians both day and night. The shots did not give the defenders any peace. Standing up in the trench became too great a risk with the surgeon's scope targeting so many soldiers. Obviously, the surgeon was not alone. So many other snipers walked through Vuhledar with their rifles in hand, making their way through the trees until they found the right spots. Their spotters helped find the targets. The scopes and laser rangefinders measured the distance for the proper calculations for the shots. The surgeon was methodical in his shots. Once each enemy was taken down, he changed position to avoid becoming the target of drones or artillery. It was the daily routine of the surgeon around Vuhledar. Finding a trench with the Ukrainian distracted by the moments of boredom in the war was ideal. Everything seemed peaceful when the Russian artillery was resting, but the sniper lying in wait would end the enemy's moments. The assaults on these trenches weakened by artillery and snipers should have been easier, but the Ukrainian resistance was resolute in Vuhledar. The Marines approached the smoky defenses. One of them placed his rifle on the ground to shoot at the bunker from where a Ukrainian threw a grenade that exploded next to his comrades. The Russians kept pushing forward through the smoke, feeling the explosions launched by the opposing soldiers heat up their uniforms. The smoke filled the trench, with part of it finished. But that didn't seem like a happy day for the Russians, with no opportunity to film a victory in that difficult attack. At the same time, the Marines of the 155th continued their probing to try to flank Vuhledar. Novomikhaylivka was one of the Ukrainian villages whose idyllic landscape was interrupted by the fury of war. People lived in a place that was now targeted by the Russian Marines. There, the 72nd had no room to fight their stubborn opponents. The one who made contact with the 155th was the 79th Separate Air Assault Brigade. In May 2022, the men of the 79th had already experienced thermobaric munitions, sucking the air from their positions to turn it into pure fire the next moment. TOS, 1 ballistic missile, 21 Grad and mortars dropped their munitions on a still green village full of small houses. The Ukrainian trenches among the buildings suffered just as much as the walls and roofs that collapsed. That was a month when the 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division used its mortars to attack the Ukrainian infantry in the trenches, joining its efforts with the 155th. 79 destroyed an MT, 12 Rapira anti-tank guns so that their armored vehicles could advance. The Ukrainian T-80 crossed the road to look for a position to fire at the Russian offensive that was starting to trouble 79 in Novomikhaylivka. The two A-46 cannon easily reached the enemies at 3 kilometers. The Russians wanted that village. They kept sending their troops to their new target. That village was crucial for controlling the route to Kostiantynivka, an important logistics hub. It was like having the key to the supply cabinet. Whoever held Kostiantynivka would control a lot. Just beyond was Vuhledar, crucially located at the crossroads of the main battle lines. The Russian tanks advanced by setting fire to the driest fields, but they themselves ended up joining the flames. Columns were shattered on the heavily mined plains by the 79, with no chance of making any progress in 2022. They were the first Russian soldiers on that front, running along the roads in search of new cover while their armored vehicles began to form the million-dollar metal graveyard around the city. The Russians kept challenging the 79 that year. The communes tried to reach the tree lines, however they were met with a lot of smoke. The vehicles were covered by the dense destruction. The countryside landscape was stained by the gray clouds of war. The troops escaped from the traps their armored vehicles had become to try to find new protection among the trees. But it was all for nothing. The drones lurked in the skies, watching the Russians' quick steps as they tried to escape the horror of yet another failed attack. The grenades fell on these men, sparing not even those who tried to help the wounded. There were many Ukrainian hideouts throughout the Novomikhaylivka area. Russian drones observed every defended position. The artillery thanked them for the coordinates and fired their shots. The 155 didn't mind using up all its ammunition to cover the smoke fields. They wanted to blow up all the Ukrainian defenses. They needed to leave the entire network impossible for the enemy soldiers to maintain. The firing sequences were long, with intervals filled with a devilish rhythm throughout the day. Starting in May 2023, the attacks began to intensify in Novomikhaylivka. The Great Shaman Vuhledar had passed, and reinforcements from the 155th arrived to bombard more and more Ukrainian positions. The drones found bases that were destroyed by precision strikes. The 79th began to experience the horror of the high-explosive aerial bomb. 500s the glide bombs so cheap that they were dropped by the dozens on Ukrainian positions. They would be fundamental in the entire Russian advance in that direction. The Russians attempted a night attack, believing they had already destroyed enough of the Ukrainians to be able to break through with force. The column was initially met by mines, which stopped the first armored vehicle. The artillery of the 79th gave the guests a good night with a succession of shots, which turned yet another brave column into sukkata. The exchanges of courtesies during the night happened on both sides. The Russian Sudoplatov drones were mass-produced and cheap. The volunteer brigade could produce more than 1,000 per day. The Ukrainians felt their efficiency in the midst of darkness. Their explosions reached the soldiers during their movements at night, cutting off the routes for rotations. The equipment was another type of target that exploded in the darkness, making the men wake up in despair, afraid of being hit at any moment. The 79th Brigade deployed its drones to observe the Russian columns. One of the armored vehicles, already filled with smoke, tried to escape in the middle of the column that had been destroyed by Ukrainian forces the day before. Hit hard, it went to the side of the road covered by the dark air. One of the crew members ran out to hide in the metal graveyard. However, the grenade marked with his fate was already ready to take him out of combat. Winter had already arrived in Novomikhaylivka at the end of 2023. The bears tried to hide among the metal that had already cooled after the flames went out. They had to run with their hearts pounding when they saw the explosives swinging from the drones. They were hard days for the wounded soldier, watching the threat descend upon him. A survivor rolled out of the armored vehicle where he had kept himself warm during the night. The drone waited for him to wish him good morning on the freezing morning and began the chase to warm him up with an explosion before the cold embrace of death could take him. The advance of the Russian Marines was not easy. Inside their armored vehicles, they watched the explosions around them, unable to do anything but wait to be put into combat positions while still having a chance to survive. They got out of the vehicle and began approaching the Ukrainian trench. A grenade launcher kindly filled the air with smoke so the soldiers could run to the entrance of the trenches with their helmets deflecting the suppressive fire. The tension was transferred to the trigger fingers, making the metal fire at enemy positions. They used the grenade launchers attached to their rifles to shoot at the positions ahead. They had to clear the way and make the Ukrainians duck. The shots were followed by requests for the comrades to throw the grenades. The rifles spat bullets at the Ukrainians as the men tried to advance. It was necessary to be quick to reload after firing so many rounds. Every moment was crucial in the trench. A full magazine was used against the dark bunkers, filling the air with metal. The rifles propelled death into the hideouts. Every hole was cleared and checked by the comrades. A survivor could be a threat to a careless squad. The grenades exploded in the positions ahead. They kept finding the bodies of the men hit by the Russian gunfire. The work continued with more grenades flying over the holes. The Marines acted in partnership, passing ammunition from one to another and throwing more and more explosives over the trench. The shots fired into the holes were a precaution even when there was a sign that everything was empty. The Marines took some of the positions in that early winter of 2023, when the situation in Vuhledar remained the same. Not every Russian advance was that successful. Many men on top of their armored vehicles took the impact of the kamikaze drones. The kamikazes never spared the armored columns, making multiple dives as long as there were vehicles that could be salvaged or men hiding among them. Severe injuries incapacitated many of the soldiers, requiring some armored vehicles to risk themselves to save them. Placed on top of the BMPs, the men suffered from more dives by the airborne pests. The wounded piled up on top of the transport, while others lost in the field desperately tried to catch a ride out of hell. The crew wanted to get out of there before their souls joined those of their compatriots. In this desperation, men full of fear and pain were left behind without the strength to climb up. One tried to run using what little energy he had left to save his life. It was useless. Hope filled him the moment he grabbed the metal, but his strength faded instantly, making his fingers let go of his chance to escape. They remained in the field like more pieces forgotten by the armed forces. Growing weaker and weaker under the freezing wind, the Russian soldiers lay down in the craters from previous explosions. They served almost as markers for the targets of the explosives dropped by the drones. Some still managed to hide inside the armored vehicles, but the Ukrainians searched every vehicle that was still operational to blow it up. The Russians wouldn't get any of them back. The luckiest ones went into abandoned trenches, and there they were visited by fire that was dropped from the sky. Those who were lucky enough to still find a standing building sometimes got too distracted by a feeling that doesn't belong in war. The kamikaze drone showed up to fix that. Victims of successive explosions, men bled under the icy winds that brought the snowflakes. Their comrades tried to help while enemy drones hadn't arrived yet. In that sadness of war, those soldiers saw how their lives were small sparks that shone and faded under the icy shroud of death.